Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 536, Revolution from Above. We left off last time with the advent of the Pacific War, the destructive conflict between Japan and the Allies, most prominently the United States. And just to be upfront, I do not plan to devote really any time in this series to a discussion of that conflict in depth for a few reasons. First, it's one of the most talked about wars in human history, so if you're interested in the Pacific War, I don't think it's going to be hard to find material. Second, there are a lot of famous events in that conflict to cover, and there's no way I could get to them all while keeping to my outline for this series, plus I've touched on quite a few in particular already, which you can find in the back archive. In particular, I do think the 6-episode series on the atomic bomb, starting with episode 108, is one of the best things I've done in terms of research, though the older stuff does tend to have some rough audio quality. What can I say? Academia doesn't do a great job preparing you for sound editing. Finally, and this might seem a bit paradoxical given what I've just said, but in a certain sense, there's actually not that much to talk about. Japan's plan to win the war against America was to try, as we've seen, to land a single devastating blow that would take the US out of the war quickly and result in a negotiated peace favoring Japan. The hope, in essence, was to do again what had been attempted in 1904 at the start of the Russo-Japanese War. Instead, the Pearl Harbor strike enraged Americans and was not successful in annihilating the US Pacific Fleet. In particular, its 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, the most important assets of the whole fleet, were all away from base at the time and thus safe. And in point of fact, I would argue that within about half a year of Pearl Harbor, it was Japan that had decisively lost the war, when a good chunk of the Imperial Japanese Navy was wiped out at Midway, including 4 of its aircraft carriers and some of its most experienced crews. From that point on, the original plan to try and set up a defensive perimeter to ward away American counterattacks until the US came to the table was no longer viable. America had the decisive advantage at sea, and it was only going to get more decisive as time went on. Realistically, from this point on, the original plan to win the war wasn't just unlikely, it was completely unworkable. But Japanese leaders were not willing to admit that, particularly once, in 1943, the Allies declared their goal to be the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, so no negotiations that would allow Japan to hang on to some of its wartime gains. Instead, the leadership in Tokyo clung to increasingly absurd notions about doing just enough damage to the American will to fight that the US would come to the table and Japan could hang on to something. Any day now, it would happen, of course. The Americans were decadent, spiritually weak liberals, so how could it not? Chasing that absurd notion in order to avoid confronting the reality of their own failure kept Japan in the war until August of 1945 and killed millions of people. On August 15th, 1945, the war finally did end, with the Showa Emperor, known in the West more commonly by his personal name, Hirohito, reading out an imperial rescript on the termination of the war that never once used the word surrender, and instead noted in language that personally I find somewhat darkly comical that, quote, the war has not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage. Which, yeah, no kidding. A few weeks later, on September 2nd, the American battleship Missouri entered Tokyo Bay for the signing of a formal surrender. As Japanese government officials boarded the USS Missouri to sign the instrument of surrender, they were greeted to a small spectacle that had been the brainchild of one General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had arranged for the original 31-star American flag that had flown on the Susquehanna during the Perry expedition, and which Perry had then bequeathed to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, to be brought to Asia. He hung it in a portrait frame on the main deck of the ship. In his speech on the occasion of the surrender, MacArthur described Perry as aiming to, quote, bring Japan an era of enlightenment and progress by lifting the veil of isolation to the friendship, trade, and commerce of the world, unquote. What the Japanese statesman listening to the speech thought of that remark remains unrecorded. Regardless, the war was now over, and in its aftermath, a new order quickly emerged. American planners had been working on a vision for post-war Japan for several years by this point, and on the very day of surrender, the plan went into motion. That plan, broadly, was for the Allies to occupy Japan, but unlike Germany, which was split into 4 occupation zones, American, French, British, and Soviet, here there would be no divided occupation. Stalin did attempt to convince the Americans that his cooperation in the final days of the Pacific War, when he declared war on Japan the same day the Nagasaki bomb was dropped, meant that the USSR deserved a small section of occupation for itself, but the Americans would never hear of it. Stalin had to content himself with control of Manchuria and the northern part of Korea, as well as the retaking of southern Sakhalin, lost by the Tsar, and the claiming of the Kuril Islands ceded in the Meiji years. So, while Stalin had to content himself with his little liberated zone that totally wasn't just the Russian Empire 2.0, in Japan proper, the Americans were calling the shots. Their leader was the very same General Douglas MacArthur who had directed the surrender ceremony on September 2nd. MacArthur was picked to lead the occupation for a few different reasons. First, he was one of the 2 most prestigious military commanders in the Pacific Theater, rivaled only by Admiral Chester Nimitz. Second, he was a Republican, and the Democratic administration of the new President Harry Truman wanted to prove its bipartisan bona fides. Third, MacArthur had been an administrator in the U.S. colonial regime in the Philippines back in the 1930s, and the thinking was that this gave him both administrative experience, fair enough, and experience working in Asia, which is a bit more problematic given that Japan is not the Philippines, and that, at any rate, in the time-honored colonial tradition, MacArthur had spent most of his time with other Americans in the high-end neighborhoods in Manila than he had with the locals. Regardless, MacArthur was in charge, given the title of Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers in Japan. The government he formed under him used that same title, SCAP, and would run the country for more than half a decade. SCAP consisted of thousands of civilian and military personnel, mostly Americans, but with a few representatives of the other allies in there too, who essentially set up a new bureaucracy to control Japan. Most of the high-level people were old-time MacArthur loyalists, many of whom had been on his staff since his days in the Philippines back in the 30s. And indeed, despite the fact that ostensibly SCAP was accountable both to a Far Eastern Commission back in Washington, D.C., and an Allied Council in Tokyo where the other powers were represented, practically speaking, it was really all MacArthur's show. The general never really brooked outside interference in what he saw as his responsibility to remake Japan. The lower levels of SCAP, meanwhile, were filled by a wide range of people, including a specialist in labor organizing, a German judge with a background in the Japanese legal system, and a Jewish-American Austrian refugee who spoke Japanese fluently, among many, many others. Largely absent from this group, though, were any Americans with a pre-war background in Japan, particularly former diplomats who were perceived as too tied to the old way of doing things, too sympathetic to the Meiji system to oversee its teardown and reconstruction from the ground up. So what were the goals of this motley assortment of people? These were spelled out in a post-surrender policy guideline drawn up by the American government, but the goals spelled out there were very broad, and practically speaking, SCAP had a lot of leeway in how it approached them. By the way, you might be wondering how SCAP was supposed to implement all the policies it decided on, given that it was overseen by a bunch of Americans, and we are not exactly known for our familiarity with foreign languages in general or Japanese in particular. That's not to mention the fact that MacArthur and his closest supporters were military men, not politicians or bureaucrats. The answer here is that SCAP just kind of grafted itself on top of the existing state structure. If you ever saw one of those social pyramids social studies teachers love to use as a diagram in grade school, just imagine a new layer being smacked onto the top of the pyramid. SCAP just replaced the existing military and bureaucratic leadership that had previously made decisions, with the rest of the governing structure of pre 1945 Japan remaining intact. That certainly made things easier, but it would also have some unintended consequences down the line. Anyway, broadly speaking, MacArthur was handed two goals to accomplish in Japan: democratize the country and demilitarize it. There was a third implicit goal here as well. Given the already rising tensions of the Cold War, MacArthur was supposed to rebuild Japan as an American aligned bastion in Asia. That wasn't really a hugely pressing issue until about 1948 1949, when the initial choice for the main American ally in Asia, the Republic of China, began to implode in the face of Mao Zedong and his Communist Party. Once China was no longer on the table as a major American ally, making Japan into an American bulwark in Asia suddenly became a lot more important. That final goal of the occupation is something we'll spend a bit more time on later in the episode, but I do want to highlight it here early on. The first year of the occupation, however, was focused overwhelmingly on the first two goals, and in particular, dismantling what the American authorities perceived as the foundation of wartime militarism. This meant first and foremost the shuttering of both the Army and the Navy and the mass demobilization of soldiers and seamen as quickly as they could be brought home. Indeed, one of the biggest logistical undertakings of the whole occupation era was simply evacuating Japanese settlers and military men from the former colonies, a process that took literal years to complete, and famously a few tenacious soldiers refused to believe the surrender was real for decades more. It's also worth noting that the Soviet Union in particular delayed the process of handing over prisoners of war. It held on to huge numbers of Japanese prisoners captured in Manchuria and what became North Korea for years, utilizing them for labor to rebuild the shattered Soviet system, before eventually caving into international pressure and returning them home. And by the way, the Soviets were also not done taking Sakhalin or the Kuril Islands when Japan surrendered on August 15th, and kept their military operations rolling for a few more weeks regardless to finish those goals. Turns out that Stalin guy, not super trustworthy. Anyway, the military institutions of the pre-war period were shuttered with astonishing rapidity, with the Army and Navy ministries themselves being shuttered in November 1945. The rapidity, of course, was intended to get any military-aligned figures out of the government as quickly as possible. It did have a few unfortunate side effects, though. The Army, in particular, had stockpiled a lot of supplies to repel an American invasion, including more traditional fare as well as a truly massive amount of methamphetamines to keep the soldiers alert. Those drugs were promptly stolen from Army supply depots once the Army started to shut down, and in particular became a massive source of funding for the revival of the old Yakuza in the post-war era. Also rather poorly handled in all of this were military men themselves, who, remember, were conscripts outside of the officer corps. They had not chosen to join up. The end of the military ministries meant no veteran supports or pensions to support any of them, including any who were too injured to work. The sight of former soldiers begging in public spaces was a very common one during the immediate post-war. Despite all of this, abolishing the military was overwhelmingly popular during the occupation. After all, the common thinking was the military deserved most of the blame for dragging Japan into an unwinnable war, which wasn't unfair, but then and now there was a tendency to downplay how popular the Empire's wars had been with the masses, at least until the wars started to go badly. Less popular was the decision by SCAP to suppress anything that, in the view of its censors, smacked of pre-war militarist ideology, by which was meant anything that could be viewed as pro-military propaganda. So, for example, SCAP banned the performance of certain kabuki plays, most noticeably the Chushingura, the dramatized retelling of the 47 Ronin tale, which had been held up by the wartime government as an example of loyalty to one's master unto death. It also censored publications it viewed as excessively militarist, while quietly banning the discussion of other subjects viewed as potentially anti American, most notably any public discussion of materials related to the atomic bombings. Even martial arts like judo and kendo suffered brief bans under SCAP, given that they had been part of required courses at military academies. All of these choices were less popular than the abolition of the military had been, and those bans that weren't quietly walked back by SCAP later on were all immediately reversed when the occupation ended. But in the immediate moment, it also wasn't like the average person on the street could really do anything about it. After all, what were they going to do? SCAP was not subject to any oversight on the Japanese side. Beyond demilitarization, the other and far more complicated goal of the early occupation was to democratize Japan, the theory being that a more democratic Japan would never be a threat to the peace of Asia again. Now, democratization was a big task that involved remaking, just to give a few examples, the school system from the ground up, decentralizing it and setting local school boards up with more oversight, remaking the Japanese economy so that less power was concentrated in the hands of powerful zaibatsu megacorporations. It meant setting up very strict rules around the government's ability to influence religious movements or to preference Shinto above other religions. It meant protections for workers and especially the right to unionize. There is no way we could do all of this justice. And to be honest, I want to focus on what I think are the two most important aspects of democratization: the imperial institution and the constitution. The question of what to do with Japan's emperor, Hirohito, or the Showa emperor if you want to be more formal, had been a topic of substantial discussion among the Allies throughout the war years. On the one hand, as we've seen, Japan's emperors reigned but didn't traditionally rule. It was hard to argue that Hirohito himself had masterminded Japan's wartime militarism. On the other hand, he was the head of state and on paper the head of government. The young emperor, 44 at the time of surrender, had intervened in policy before, for example demanding the punishment of the assassins of Zhang Zuolin in 1929, and dramatically interceding at the end of the war to throw his opinion in favor of surrender. So clearly he did have some power, and he could have done more to rein in the worst of the wartime behaviors. There was also the awkward fact that if one considered the sweep of Japanese aggression across the 30s and 40s, there was only one person who'd actually been in power that entire time: the emperor. And of course, all of this had been done in his name, so how could he not bear some responsibility? The debates around this question were, and remain to this day, very intense, but they also don't really matter to us that much here, because in what could be considered something of a pattern for SCAP, only one person's opinion on this question actually mattered, and he made his mind up pretty quickly. That one person was, of course, General Douglas MacArthur. Just days after Japan's formal surrender in early September 1945, Hirohito himself came calling on the new SCAP commander, quite a concession in and of itself, given that the emperor does not traditionally make house calls. Now, we don't know quite what happened in this meeting. The only interpreters present were part of the notoriously tight-lipped Imperial Household Ministry, which has since been demoted, by the way, to a mere agency in the government. Whatever happened, MacArthur was very impressed by the meeting, referring to Hirohito afterwards as, quote, the first gentleman of Japan, and saying the emperor had offered to abdicate and take full responsibility for the war. Apparently, MacArthur decided more or less there and then that he was going to protect Hirohito, despite calls throughout 1945 and 1946 within Japan that Hirohito abdicate, and in some cases, that the institution of the emperorship be abolished outright. But those calls didn't matter. Hirohito was the ultimate decision maker, and his loyalists at the top of SCAP enforced his will. Talk of getting rid of the emperor was swiftly slapped down. When former Prime Minister Konoe stated that he believed personally the emperor should abdicate, all that resulted was SCAP officials labeling him as, quote, a rat who was prepared to sell anyone to save himself. Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe, an intelligence expert and one of the people charged with assembling a list of war criminals to be tried by SCAP, stated openly his agreement with MacArthur on the question of keeping Hirohito on the throne because, quote, otherwise we would have nothing but chaos. The religion was gone, the government was gone, and he was the only symbol of control. Now, I know he had his hand in the cookie jar, and he wasn't an innocent little child, but he was of great use to us, and that was the basis on which I recommended to the old man, MacArthur, that we keep him. MacArthur and his loyalists held steadfastly to this opinion, and for his part, while Hirohito appears to have been willing to abdicate to save the imperial household, he wasn't going to do it if he didn't have to. One of his closest advisors, Kido Koichi, advised the emperor both in 1945 and again in 1951 at the end of the occupation to abdicate because otherwise, quote, the end result will be that the imperial family alone will have failed to take responsibility and an unclear mood will remain, which I fear might leave an eternal scar. But nothing ever came of it. Instead, Hirohito and SCAP embarked on a bold new initiative to remake the Emperor's image from the ground up. On January 1st, 1946, Hirohito gave a New Year's address where, under the direction of SCAP, he proclaimed that, quote, the ties between us and our people have always stood upon mutual trust and affection. They do not depend on mere legends and myths. They are not predicated on the false conception that the Emperor is divine. It should be noted that there remains a lot of controversy over the wording of this proclamation because the Japanese text uses a different word, akitsumikami, from the one used in imperial propaganda going back to the Nara period, arahitogami. Today, right-wing groups maintain the position that the emperor still is a descendant of the gods and has not publicly renounced his divinity. Regardless, in the eyes of SCAP, Hirohito had done the important work of proclaiming that he was no longer a god, and simply a more democratic sort of monarch. He was then trotted out for a series of national tours intended to build support for the new regime by showing the emperor himself as democratized, dressed up in a suit, tie, and top hat, afoot instead of on horseback, and generally being portrayed as a man of the people. He was encouraged to shake hands with the commoners, something he was apparently never very good at, and to take up some unthreatening hobbies. He settled on marine biology. There's a lot more to say about the remaking of Hirohito's image and what we can determine about how the man himself felt about it all, but of course, there's not room for it here, but I can direct you to the 6-part series on Hirohito, starting with episode 226 if you really want to get into it. Episodes 230 and 231 deal with his post-war life, if that's what you're interested in. What I want to talk about now is another side of democratization, the Constitution. From the start of the occupation, revising the Meiji Constitution to make it more democratic had always been a goal, but remarkably, there wasn't a lot of actual groundwork done to decide on what that was going to look like in practice. Initially, the civilian government of Japan handed the job over to Matsumoto Joji, a specialist in commercial law who assembled a team of experts to draft a new Japanese constitution in the fall of 1945. However, the new constitution, when it was presented to General MacArthur, was deemed unacceptable because it was just a modified version of the Meiji system that essentially made the emperor into a constitutional monarch but left pretty much everything else intact. This was felt to be insufficiently democratic, but here, rather than directing Matsumoto to have another go at it, MacArthur decided on something different. He directed Brigadier General Courtney Whitney, head of SCAP's government section, to assemble a team of SCAP personnel to draft a model constitution that could serve as a guide for the Japanese. Of course, what that really meant was just drafting a plan the Japanese would approve. Nobody actually labored under the impression that this was a model the Japanese could use to do something themselves. To guide him in remaking Japan's constitution, Whitney was given a couple of notes on a piece of paper that apparently no one thought to hang on to. It has since been lost. According to those present, the notes were essentially, the emperor must rule by the consent of the people, war should be abolished, more about that in a second, Japan should rely on, quote, the higher ideals which are now stirring the world, while the feudal system of Japan will cease. Finally, the peerage should be abolished and budgetary affairs arranged, quote, after the British system. That's obviously not a lot to go on, not least of all given that the team assembled by General Whitney to do the drafting in February 1946 was promptly set up in the sixth floor of Tokyo's Daiichi Seimei building, which was now the SCAP headquarters, and told they had 1 week to put together a functional draft. That functional draft was actually finished early, in only 6 days. If you're wondering at a comparison, America's Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia ran from May 25th to September 17th, 1787, so 116 days or about 16 and a half weeks if I'm doing my math right. Now, the deliberations of this group are well documented and very interesting. Everyone involved was pretty clear on the significance of what it was they were doing and documented their thought process very clearly. Of course, there's no way for us to meaningfully touch on everything in what was fundamentally a ground up rewrite of the whole Japanese system of government, not a revision, but a constitutional scrap and do over. That said, there are a few areas I'd be remiss not to touch on. For example, MacArthur's dictum that the feudal system of Japan be undone resulted in a sweeping Chapter 3 entitled The Rights and Duties of the People, and intended to codify a wide ranging array of new rights equal to, or in some cases exceeding, the American Bill of Rights. Thus, Article 13 spells out an explicit right to, quote, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a direct reference to the language of the Declaration of Independence. Articles 16, 19, 20, and 21 lay out rights of freedom of assembly, thought, association, religion, and speech, broadly equivalent to the legal rules around America's First Amendment, and Articles 33 through 39 lay out requirements for warrant procedures and habeas corpus, similar to the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments in the US. In other cases, though, the Japanese document goes a lot further, a reflection of the fact that, while MacArthur himself was a Republican, most of those who'd signed up to work for the Truman administration were good old New Deal Democrats invested in a far more hands-on approach to the government making people's lives better. So Article 23 guarantees academic freedom. Article 26 guarantees the right to an equal education. Article 28 protects unionization rights. My favorite, Article 25, guarantees a right to, quote, minimum standards of wholesome and cultured living, and oh boy, is there a boatload of legal scholarship about what that means in practice. Probably the most remarkable additions, though, are Articles 14 and 24, which collectively prohibit discrimination under the law and enshrine the equality of men and women in marriage, essentially guaranteeing the constitutional equality of women in Japan. These two articles are the brainchild of one of the most fascinating figures involved in this story, and the only one of any of the people in the room drafting the Constitution who'd been in Japan before 1945, Beata Sirota. She was born in 1923, the child of Austrian Jews who fled that country during the rise of the Nazis. Her father was a music teacher and managed to land a job at Tokyo's Imperial Academy of Music. Today, it's Tokyo's University of Fine Arts. Sirota lived with her parents in Tokyo for 10 years before moving to the US to attend Mills College, because, well, American schools weren't exactly welcoming to Jews given the history of anti-Jewish quotas in this country. They were a better option than European ones at the time. Thus, she was separated from her parents at the time of Pearl Harbor and ended up marrying a US citizen and naturalizing during the intervening years. After the end of the war, given her ability to speak Japanese, she was a shoo-in for the SCAP bureaucracy, and if you are wondering, yes, she did go back and find her parents. Both of them survived the war okay. Sirota's first-hand experience seeing how women had been treated in pre-war Japan led her to insist on the inclusion of Articles 14 and 24. Any other attempt to enshrine the rights of women, she insisted, would be undone by a simple vote in the Diet the moment the Americans left town. The other, far more debated aspect of the post-war Constitution is, of course, its most controversial inclusion, Article 9, which I am just going to read to you in full. Quote, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of the belligerency of the state will not be recognized. That's obviously pretty sweeping. Neither of the two Germanys, for example, had anything like this inserted in their post war constitutions. To my knowledge, the only other country ever to abolish its military altogether is the mighty powerhouse of Costa Rica. The origins of Article 9 are contentious among scholars, to put it lightly. MacArthur had included it in his initial brief on the new Constitution. There was a lot of debate over whether this was initially MacArthur's idea, or if he was convinced by one of the old school liberals in Japan who'd survived the war years, Shidehara Kijiro, who'd been a diplomat in the 20s and watched the military undo all his hard work, making Japan a part of the global community, and thus wanted to ensure the military would never again be in a position to influence policy. We don't really know for sure one way or another, though the Shidehara thesis tends to be more popular today, but honestly the origin doesn't matter that much, just that Article 9 was put in. The original language was watered down a little bit, though. Charles Cadies, one of the people in the government section, felt MacArthur's initial draft, which banned war even for self-defense, was a bit extreme, and so deleted the ban on self-defense from the text. That change would have big impacts down the line. It is the legal basis on which the current iteration of the Japanese military, the Jietai or self-defense forces, is founded. The final draft of the new constitution was presented to Japanese government leaders on February 13th in a private meeting led by MacArthur's right-hand man and the head of the government section, General Courtney Whitney. Whitney started off by stating that the old Matsumoto draft was, quote, wholly unacceptable to the Supreme Commander as a document of freedom and democracy. Then he distributed the new American draft and left the Japanese to read it, quipping once they were done that he'd been, quote, enjoying their atomic sunshine while he waited. And by the way, that's a quote from Whitney directly, who also recalled with great relish later on that at that exact moment a B-29 bomber identical to the one used to drop the atomic bombs happened to fly overhead. Even without Whitney's bit of needling, I don't think anyone in the room could have really missed what was going on here, and despite the objections of basically every Japanese leader in the room who all felt the text was too extreme in its liberalism, the new example was quickly kicked up the chain. Emperor Hirohito apparently hated it because it hugely reined in the emperor, but felt he had no choice but to approve it. He submitted the new constitution to the Diet as an amendment following the procedures of the existing Meiji constitution. That amendment, which replaced the entire constitution in one go, was promptly ratified, the only time the Meiji constitution was ever successfully amended. The new constitution went into effect in 1947 and has remained in place with no amendments or modifications ever since. The new constitution was emblematic of what democratizing Japan meant to SCAP. SCAP even published a whole fun series of cartoons explaining in simple language how the old system compared to the new one. I'll include some examples in the show notes. But as time went on, of course, democratization and demilitarization became less important than the third goal of the occupation, making Japan into an American bastion in Asia. That choice was, of course, driven by the rise of the Cold War, and in Asia in particular, the rise of the People's Republic of China in 1949, and the start of the Korean War the very next year in 1950. There were a few other factors at play, though. Most notably, General MacArthur had, by this point, his eyes on a potential Republican run for president, and he'd probably been planning that more or less from the time World War II ended. Given his ambitions, he was very worried about being attacked by the right from his own party, with accusations of, in essence, allowing Reds to run rampant in Japan. The number of left-wing policies SCAP had implemented and the fact that political liberalization had allowed Japan's socialist and communist movements to re-emerge represented big political vulnerabilities for MacArthur, at least within the Republican Party. And he really cared about this. MacArthur actually pushed for a formal peace deal with Japan in 1947 because he said he wasn't going to pursue politics until there was one, and if there was a treaty in 1947, he could have run for president in 1948. In reality, he probably didn't need to worry that much. He did throw his name in the ring in both 1948 and 1952 and got crushed in the Republican primaries both times. Still, these concerns about the occupation enabling the rise of the extreme left in Japan led to some pretty dramatic policy reversals over the course of the era, a phenomenon we call the reverse course. To give you an idea of some of the changes implemented as a part of the reverse course, May 1st, 1946 was the first May Day, a traditional socialist holiday, since the end of the war. There were, of course, massive demonstrations organized by leftist groups, about 1 million workers in the streets just in Tokyo, which were largely peaceful, mostly focused on issues of food insecurity that plagued Japan early in the post war. The most dramatic occurrence was a group of just over 100 protesters who managed to force their way onto the grounds of the Imperial Palace, not by hurting anybody, they just pushed past the guards to deliver a letter to the Imperial household asking the Emperor to intercede on the food issue. But that didn't stop MacArthur from labeling all of these demonstrations as violent. Nor did the shift stop here. Early in the occupation years, the economy in general was obviously not in great shape. Economically devastating wars will do that to you. And so major unions, assured of their right to organize under the new constitution, planned a big general strike for February 1st, 1947, the goal being to demand better wages to help their members survive the economic turmoil. That plan came to a screeching halt when MacArthur announced he was outlawing the general strike on the grounds it would be too disruptive, literally hours before the strike was supposed to start. Supposedly, union leaders trying to negotiate with government officials right before the strike burst into tears when they heard the news. Eventually, MacArthur would go so far as to take one of the basic weapons of the occupation for democratizing the country and turn it on the leftists. This was the so-called purge, essentially SCAP having the legal authority to ban figures from public office. Early in the occupation, purge targets were members of the wartime government, officials and bureaucrats associated with the wartime regime, or former officers in the military. In particular, those targeted for trial at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the so-called Tokyo War Crimes Trials, the counterpart of the Nuremberg Tribunal, were purged in the interim. But those war crimes trials were quietly abandoned after the first round ended in December 1948. That first round of trials had taken far longer than anyone had expected, and it was obvious as well that future trials would be hard to hold without running the risk of implicating the emperor. Many of those purged in expectation of a future trial, including at least one future prime minister who'd been indicted for high-level war crimes, were released and eventually depurged. And starting in 1949 and 1950, MacArthur began deploying the purge against socialists and communists in a so-called Red Purge. For example, targeting the entire Central Committee of the Japanese Communist Party after a scuffle between their members and some Americans resulted in the JCP putting out a press release calling their members martyrs. MacArthur's turn against the Japanese left helps partially explain why, from an initial surge of support in the mid-40s, the political left would peter out dramatically in Japan, though he's not the only reason. We'll get to the others soon. More notably, it reveals one of the core tensions of the occupation. The US occupation of Japan was, in essence, revolution from above, democracy, American style, imposed at gunpoint via the whims of a military bureaucracy governed by a single man. And I don't want to mix my words here. The pre-1945 government of Japan was bad, and its end improved the world. The democratic reforms imposed by the Constitution and by other SCAP policies have, on the whole, at least in my view, made Japan a objectively better place. And yet there will always be a sort of tension, one Japanese right-wingers use to this very day to attack the Constitution and the whole post-war order in a system that was imposed at gunpoint in the name of democracy. Grappling with that legacy is, at least in my view, one of the key themes and an unresolved issue in post-war Japanese history. But of course, we're not going to resolve it here. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shout out tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher, Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time for the end of the occupation and the start of the official post-war.